Hey guys, tonight we begin with a quiet question, something you almost never hear in a documentary. Did early humans ever save each other from predators? Dim the lights, settle in. Let's drift back into a world of dusk, rustling grass, distant roars, and fragile bodies huddled around flickering firelight. We tend to imagine that our ancestors lived in constant dread of claws, jaws, and massive beasts. And in many ways, that's true. Early hominins were prey before they were predators. But between the panic and the extinction, there must have been moments of solidarity. A stumble helped, a warning call, a spear thrown in defense of someone else. Small acts of care that might have changed everything. Picture a dry plain in Africa, half light, half shadow. A group of early humans, call them proto-humans, awake, eyes scanning the dark. The night is alive with threats. Lions, leopards, hyenas. The air carries distant growls. What could one human do? Very little, but their strength in numbers. When predators stalk, groups had options. Someone watches. Someone signals. Someone fights. It's dangerous. It's messy. But in that danger lies a quiet power, cooperation. Modern theorists argue that many human traits, from musical rhythm to body odor, from long hair to group singing, could have been part of a warning display system against predators. It's called aposematism. Like how bright colors warn animals, I'm dangerous, don't eat me. Early humans might have developed subtle versions, rhythmic calls, loud chorus, synchronized action, to say, don't pick us off, one by one. Some think that making noise, drums, chant, group shout, could have deterred predators. The cost is obvious. Noise draws attention. But if you're already in danger, making it obvious may be safer than being silent and alone. That trade-off might have pushed early humans toward cooperation, even when it carried risk. We see similar mobbing behavior in animals, birds or monkeys ganging up to harass a predator. It's not courage, just logic. Many weak creatures can overpower one strong one if they act together. Early humans likely did the same, flinging rocks, shouting, encircling, not for glory, just to keep a child alive a few minutes longer. There's fossil evidence too. Bones that show healed injuries, skull fractures, broken legs, spinal trauma, injuries that should have been fatal if no one helped. Yet those individuals lived long after. Someone must have carried them, fed them, protected them. It's not the kind of story that gets painted on cave walls, but it's quietly astonishing. The first acts of medicine weren't potions or prayers. They were simply refusing to leave someone behind. And behind that compassion might have been something older than morality, something practical. In an environment where survival is fragile, you help others because someday you'll need them to help you. It's not selfless, but it works. Reciprocity becomes instinct. Eventually, instinct becomes culture. Even the anarchist Prince Peter Kropotkin once wrote that mutual aid cooperation was a driving force of evolution. He wasn't wrong. Every time an early human shouted a warning, shared a meal, or stood between a predator and a friend, they were doing something revolutionary, proving that empathy could be as powerful as strength. Maybe that's where our story as a species really begins. Not with tools or fire, but with a decision to care. The wind moves through the tall grass, a soft rhythm against a low hum of insects. Somewhere, a hyena laughs, that eerie, rising sound that once must have sent every hair on an early human's neck standing. But this time, the group doesn't scatter. They gather closer, shoulders brushing, each one clutching a rock, a stick, a burning branch. The fear is still there, yes, but now it's shared. That's the quiet shift. Fear alone freezes you. Fear shared becomes strategy. And that shift might have been what nudged us away from the food chain's lower rungs. Archaeologists have found bite marks on early hominin bones, deep gouges from saber-toothed cats and leopards. But they've also found something stranger, marks that show deliberate cutting after death, as if others had come back to retrieve the remains, maybe even to bury or protect them. Burial is compassion fossilized. It says, even in death, you still matter to us. It's easy to forget how fragile those early lives were. No antibiotics, No safe shelter, no real weapons beyond what you could grab. And yet, somehow, they held on. They didn't just survive, they multiplied, adapted, spread. That kind of persistence doesn't come from isolation, it comes from loyalty. When we talk about predators, we imagine fangs and claws. But the real threats were exhaustion, starvation, infection. A twisted ankle could be as deadly as a lion. If you couldn't walk, you couldn't follow the herd, you couldn't find water, unless someone stayed behind. Fossil records show healed tibias, cracked ribs, mended over months. Somebody, somewhere, decided to wait. And that act, waiting, might be one of the oldest pieces of humanity. Predators act fast. Humans learned to pause, to think, to plan. You can almost picture it. One injured hunter sitting by a tree while another keeps watch. The scent of blood in the air. The sound of vultures circling. Every instinct screaming to leave. And yet, they don't. They stay. That pause is civilization in embryo. It's the beginning of responsibility. The faint outline of ethics before religion, before philosophy. Because to care is to defy nature's urgency. At some point, those pauses became habits. The watcher becomes the healer. The group becomes the tribe. And the tribe becomes a culture. You don't just save the injured. You start to expect that saving is what decent people do. Somewhere between survival and compassion, morality sneaks in. And of course, it wasn't perfect. Not everyone was saved, and not every act of care was pure. There must have been arguments, betrayals, moments when the weak were abandoned. But even that friction had purpose. It forced our ancestors to think about fairness, loyalty, guilt, all those invisible forces that still run our lives today. Predators didn't just hunt humans, they shaped our psychology. Every dark forest, every glowing pair of eyes at the edge of campfire light left an imprint. It taught us vigilance, storytelling, and superstition. We needed meaning to manage fear, so we invented it. Spirits, gods, omens, ways to make the terror predictable. So when we talk about early humans saving each other, it's not just physical rescue, it's also emotional rescue. Reassuring one another that the darkness could be understood, that the growl in the distance had a name. The moment we began telling stories about danger, we were already taming it. And maybe that's what makes our species so peculiar. We didn't just fight predators. We explained them. We gave them myths, wrapped them in language, and slowly pulled their teeth through imagination. The savannas are gone now. The predators mostly pushed to the edges of maps. But their ghosts linger in our pulse. The way we flinch at sudden movement. The way we huddle close when afraid. The reflexes of ancient knights carried quietly inside us, whispering that once, long ago, we survived because someone decided we were worth saving. If you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost feel that ancient darkness, the kind that wasn't poetic, but absolute. No streetlights, no walls, just an open plain stretching endlessly, the sound of distant predators cutting through the night air. And in the middle of it, a small group of early humans huddled around a fire, their only weapon, their only comfort. That fire was more than warmth. It was a declaration, a message to the world that said, "We are still here." Scientists believe fire control became consistent around 1,000,000 years ago, though the evidence hints it might have flickered earlier. Burnt bones, charcoal traces, stones reddened by heat, signs of long nights spent fighting back the dark. But with fire came something deeper. Time. Time to sit, to rest, to heal, to think. Predators hunt in darkness. Fire pushed that darkness back. And with that small circle of light came the first real chance to plan. To imagine what tomorrow might look like, or to share a quiet meal with someone who couldn't have survived alone. It's strange to think that the very thing that defines us, conversation, may have started as a defense strategy. Around that fire, our ancestors probably whispered about danger, shared warnings, taught lessons through stories. The tone might have been hushed, but the effect was revolutionary. Language wasn't just about naming things. It was about keeping people alive. Picture it. One person describing the shape of a predator's tracks, another mimicking its growl, a third pointing toward the horizon. Every word, every gesture, another layer of safety. Communication became our camouflage. And slowly, the bonds between individuals grew tighter. It wasn't just about protecting the injured or guarding the fire anymore. It was about emotional recognition. Empathy wasn't born in temples or cities. It was born beside embers, in that strange quiet between fear and fatigue. You can imagine a child falling asleep on a parent's lap, soot on their face, firelight flickering in their eyes. Outside, the night pulsed with unseen movement, lions, hyenas, leopards. But inside that circle, there was peace. Temporary, fragile, but real. That was the earliest form of safety, not guaranteed by walls or weapons, but by trust. And that trust rewired our species. Anthropologists have found evidence that early human groups who cared for their injured and shared food survived longer than those that didn't. Cooperation wasn't kindness, it was efficiency. A single hunter might fall to a predator, but 10 together could drive it away. And once cooperation became instinct, evolution favored it. It's easy to think of evolution as purely physical, sharper teeth, stronger limbs. But for humans, survival depended on invisible traits, patience, compassion, shared memory. We didn't outrun danger. We outthought it. Firelight gave us time to think about the past, and imagination gave us the courage to picture the future. And somewhere in that slow, smoky flicker, humanity began to stretch beyond survival. We started to wonder why the world was dangerous at all. Predators were no longer just beasts. They became symbols, challenges, teachers, and saving each other wasn't just reaction. It became ritual. When someone was injured, the act of helping wasn't merely practical anymore. It meant something. Maybe it was seen as sacred, or lucky, or a sign that the spirits approved. The first morality was probably built on gratitude, the knowledge that someone had chosen to stay when they could have run. And from that came something radical, hope. Because every act of rescue, every broken bone that healed, every night that ended with everyone still breathing, whispered the same quiet truth our species still clings to today. We are safest when we are together. As dawn broke over those endless prehistoric plains, survival began to look a little less like a scramble and a little more like a strategy. The first lights stretched across sleeping shapes huddled close together, each one breathing in rhythm with the others. A small tribe, maybe 20 or 30 people, sharing warmth, food, and now, memory. Memory was a new kind of weapon. It meant you could learn from what tried to kill you yesterday. Fossil evidence shows that early hominins, like Homo erectus and Homo heidelbergensis, started traveling in cooperative hunting bands. That wasn't just for taking down prey, it was also for defense. Picture a dozen lean figures moving through tall grass, stone-tipped spears clutched tight, watching for movement not just ahead, but behind. They didn't have metal, or armor, or walls, but they had each other, and it worked. When archaeologists study ancient bones, they find signs of healing, broken ribs, fractured skulls, even amputations that had clearly mended long before death. Someone had tended to those wounds. Someone had stayed behind to feed and protect the injured. That kind of care doesn't happen by accident. It's intentional, even organized. Imagine what that means. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, before writing, before kingdoms, before even farming, humans had already invented compassion. They didn't call it that, of course. It wasn't a philosophy. It was instinct, the slow understanding that the person next to you mattered, not just emotionally, but biologically. Your odds of surviving the next saber-toothed cat attack went up if you helped them survive the last one. That logic, that emotional math, may have been the start of morality itself. Because once you start seeing another person's pain as your problem, you've crossed an invisible line between animal and human. It's fascinating, too, that the more fragile we became physically, the smarter we got socially. Big cats had claws. Bears had muscle. We had vulnerability. And that's what forced us to evolve cooperation, empathy, and long-term memory. Predators shaped us without meaning to. Every night they prowled the edges of our camps. They trained our species to value connection. You can almost picture the first time a small band of humans came across one of their own who'd fallen, bleeding, hurt, too weak to walk. The easy choice would have been to move on. But someone stopped. Someone refused to keep walking. They lifted him awkwardly, painfully, and carried him home. That small act of resistance against nature's indifference. That's when humanity began. And over time, it became the pattern. The injured were nursed back. The old were protected. Children were shared responsibilities. Even fire, once an individual discovery, became communal property, something everyone guarded. We stopped just surviving with each other. We started surviving for each other. There's a beauty to that simplicity. Before religion, before law, before even language had full structure, people still understood loyalty. You can almost imagine the quiet after a hunt, the group resting beside a stream, dividing food evenly, tending wounds with leaves and ash, a soft sound of reassurance, maybe a hum, maybe a sigh, passing between them. That was the beginning of comfort. The first bedtime story wasn't told in words, but in presence. It's humbling to realize that our earliest ancestors weren't just clever hunters, they were caretakers, and maybe that's what truly set them apart from everything else that walked beside them, because no other species built safety out of kindness. Over time, that kindness began to reshape the landscape, not just physically, but psychologically. Once small bands of humans started realizing that we were stronger than me, everything changed. You can almost see it in the archaeological record, in the ash rings of ancient campfires, the bones neatly arranged after shared meals, the worn paths between caves that hint at early migration patterns. These weren't random wanderers anymore. They were communities. And community meant safety. Predators still roamed lions, leopards, dire wolves, even giant hyenas. But they had to think twice before attacking a coordinated group of humans armed with fire and stone. We became the danger, and maybe, just maybe, that's when the tables finally turned. But here's the twist. Even when humans won the fight for survival, we didn't lose our sense of fear. It stayed tucked deep in our DNA, a constant reminder of when we weren't the top of the food chain. That's why, even now, our hearts still race at the sound of something rustling in the dark. It's ancient programming whispering, remember when the shadows had teeth. That fear, however, wasn't just about running. It also taught us to plan. Early humans began creating sleeping circles, placing the strongest or most alert near the edges. They chose high ground, cave entrances, and narrow valleys that could be defended. Nighttime, once pure chaos, became structured, even sacred. And somewhere, in that fragile rhythm of fear and trust, something like friendship began. Think about it. Around a single fire, night after night, people started telling each other things, gestures at first, then sounds, then symbols that would eventually become language. The stories weren't about gods yet. They were about what had happened that day, who saw the leopard, who fell, who was saved. Those small retellings built the first emotional maps between people. That's how the idea of memory sharing began. A primitive kind of history. One group would remember where the predators nested. Another would remember which plants healed wounds. Over generations, those memories stacked up, not in books or databases, but in minds, layered with emotion and meaning. This is where our strange species started to become storytellers. Because survival wasn't just about knowing where the danger was. It was about remembering together. And when memory is shared, it becomes culture. That's probably why we're still obsessed with stories today. Whether it's campfire, myths, bedtime tales, or YouTube documentaries playing softly in the dark, it's ancient comfort. It's the same instinct that told our ancestors, if we tell it, maybe it won't happen again. Of course, not everything was perfect in these early tribes. There were conflicts, jealousy, hunger, betrayal. Someone would hoard food. Another would refuse to share fire. But even those tensions served a purpose. They taught humans how to negotiate, how to forgive, how to think ahead. And as the centuries passed, those small social experiments evolved into something even bigger. Tribes becoming bands, bands becoming clans, clans eventually becoming villages. All because one day, long ago, a wounded hunter was carried home instead of left behind. That moment, that choice, rippled forward across time, shaping everything that came after. The empathy that began in the dirt and darkness of prehistory still sits inside us today, quietly reminding us who we are. We are the descendants of those who stayed. As those small acts of care spread, so did our ability to imagine what others might feel. Somewhere between the flicker of a campfire and the soft hum of night insects, early humans began practicing something close to empathy, not just reacting to pain, but understanding it. You can see hints of it in fossilized remains. A fractured femur that healed cleanly, proof someone was fed and protected long enough to recover. A toothless elder whose jaw shows years of survival, meaning someone chewed their food for them. In a world where efficiency was survival, helping the weak wasn't logical, it was emotional, and that emotion became our most powerful survival tool. Predators had claws and speed. We had something stranger, the ability to care strategically. When someone fell sick, others learned which herbs might help. When a child wandered too far, someone called them back. The small, almost invisible gestures that stitched together trust, that's what made humanity unstoppable. But this shift also brought complexity. Once we started caring, we started worrying about each other, about the future, about the things we couldn't see or control. Fear and empathy became inseparable, two sides of the same firelight. And perhaps that's when the first whispers of spirituality began. Imagine it. You're sitting in the dark, listening to the night breathe. You've seen a friend die. You've seen another survive against all odds. You can't explain it, so you start to wonder if something bigger is watching, something that decides who lives and who doesn't. Maybe it's in the stars, maybe in the wind, maybe in the eyes of the predator you escaped. That wondering, that quiet awe, became the seed of belief. It wasn't religion yet, not really. It was just a feeling that the world was alive with intention. Every thunderclap, every flicker of light, every growl in the distance meant something. Humans didn't separate life and meaning. They were the same. So when one of their own died, early humans didn't simply move on. They lingered. They touched the body. Sometimes they left flowers, or red ochre, or shells, small tokens that say, "You mattered." And that's where another new instinct emerged. The desire to remember. Once humans began to remember their dead, they also began to imagine the unseen, the soul, the spirit, the part that couldn't be buried. It's fascinating to think that empathy, a simple act of carrying someone home, eventually led to ideas about immortality. Of course, these weren't grand philosophies yet. They were more like whispers between grief and hope. But they formed the roots of everything that would come later. Myth, ritual, religion, art, even language might have grown from this same need to say, "Don't go," or "They're gone," or "We'll see them again." And through all of it, the threat of predators never vanished. Lions still prowled, hyenas still circled the camp. But now, the fear wasn't paralyzing, it was organized. Fire at the center, spears stacked nearby, watchers posted at dusk. Early humans had turned survival into something close to ceremony. Every night was a ritual of defense and connection, of eyes meeting across the flames, of hearts beating in rhythm with the forest sounds. That's what made us different from every other creature out there. Not that we stopped being prey, but that we learned how to protect each other, even when it wasn't practical. Somewhere along that ancient timeline, cooperation became instinct. And once it did, evolution took notice. Those who cared lived longer. Those who stayed behind became ancestors. And from that moment on, the story of humanity stopped being about survival of the fittest and started being about survival of the kindest. And once that kindness became instinct, the shape of human life began to change forever. Tribes weren't just collections of individuals anymore. They became living organisms, bound together by memory, protection, and shared emotion. Every member mattered because every member held a piece of the group's survival. It's strange to think about, but cooperation might have sculpted our bodies as much as our minds. Look closely at human anatomy, the upright posture, the hands built for holding tools and each other, the expressive faces. They're all designed for communication, for connection. Even our eyes, the whites around the iris, are unique among primates. They make it easy to see where someone else is looking. A tiny, biological way of saying, I'm with you. Predators didn't have that, but we did, and it changed everything. With that new layer of awareness came something new. Strategy. Hunting stopped being a mad scramble for food and became a choreographed effort, silent gestures, shared plans, coordinated movement. The same instincts that helped us protect the wounded also helped us hunt, gather, and plan. You can almost imagine the scene. A group moving through tall grass, eyes darting, feet light on the soil. One raises a hand, a signal. The rest freeze. A faint sound in the distance, maybe the snort of an antelope. Then a nod, a rush, the catch, a celebration. That coordination required trust, and trust required understanding that the others would show up for you, that they'd defend you when the lions came back, that you weren't alone. And slowly, as those shared experiences built up, the stories began, around fires, under the stars, retelling how the group survived the hunt, or how someone scared away a leopard, or how an ancestor once fought a bear with nothing but a stick and sheer stubbornness. These weren't just entertainment, they were education wrapped in myth. Stories taught where to hide, when to run, what to fear, and who to follow. But more than that, they taught values, bravery, loyalty, compassion, even humor. Because yes, humor existed back then too. You can almost hear the quiet laughter over a burned piece of meat or a ridiculous failed chase. Laughter, in its own quiet way, became another kind of defense, not against predators, but against despair. When life was fragile and short, humor made it bearable, and the better we became at soothing each other, the calmer our nights grew. Fear was still there, but it was softened by familiarity, the rhythm of firelight, the smell of smoke, the closeness of breathing bodies in the dark. That's where the first threads of culture started to weave together. Not in grand monuments or tools, but in feelings. The instinct to share an experience, a story, a song, a moment of silence. Over generations, those little exchanges became rituals. A certain chant before hunting, a shared meal after a kill, a circle formed when someone died. Repetition made it sacred. And when you look at that pattern, the caring, the storytelling, the ritual, you start to realize something. Early humans weren't just surviving despite the predators. They were becoming more human because of them. Danger gave them a reason to come closer. Fear gave them empathy, and empathy gave them identity. By the time Homo sapiens began spreading across continents, the rules were written deep in our DNA. Stay close, share warmth, protect the weak, tell the story. It wasn't technology that made us who we are. It was connection. Fire was useful. Yes, spears were vital. But the real evolutionary leap was invisible. The way we looked at each other and silently agreed, we'll make it through this together. And that's how, in the shadow of teeth and claws, something astonishing happened. Predators forced us to evolve, not into stronger beasts, but into gentler ones. That gentleness, strangely enough, was our superpower. Other animals evolved armor, venom, or claws. We evolved empathy, and empathy, as it turned out, was far deadlier than fangs. It let us build alliances, share information, and eventually outthink anything that wanted to eat us. But even as our minds grew sharper, the world stayed ruthless. The Ice Age didn't care about feelings. Neither did cave bears or saber-toothed cats. And yet, our ancestors kept forming circles, kept tending fires, kept singing into the wind, because cooperation had already sunk too deep to die. It's tempting to imagine early humans as terrified, constantly glancing over their shoulders. But fossils and cave art suggest something quieter, almost peaceful. These people weren't just hiding from predators. They were observing them, learning their habits, studying how they moved, how they hunted, how they communicated. Some anthropologists even think we borrowed predator techniques. The coordinated chase, the flank and ambush, the patience of a stalking cat. We didn't just survive the beasts, we learned from them. And when that knowledge blended with our empathy, you got something entirely new. Teamwork. Wolves hunt in packs, but humans built strategies, a kind of social chess against nature itself. Picture this: dawn mist, grass soaked with dew, a group moving like a single organism. One distracts, one circles, one waits. It's not just instinct anymore, it's intelligence shared in silence. That's the first spark of what would one day become planning, warfare, even science. But the story isn't only about triumph. Cooperation came with costs. It meant emotional pain, too. When someone died, the group didn't just lose a body, they lost a memory, a friend, a protector. Burial sites from hundreds of thousands of years ago show signs of care. Flowers, pigments, even animal bones placed like gifts. That's grief, that's love, and that's proof that humanity's heart was already awake long before civilization. Some researchers argue that this compassion wasn't a side effect, it was the adaptation. A group that mourned together, stayed together. A tribe that carried its injured could keep its hunters longer. A family that shared food through sickness had better odds of survival next season. It's such a beautiful paradox. The same vulnerability that made us easy prey also made us unstoppable. Of course, the predators never went away entirely. Leopards and lions still prowled the edges of human camps. You can imagine the flicker of eyes in the darkness, the smell of danger just beyond the firelight. But by then, fear had a new shape. It was collective. One scream meant 10 spears lifted. One roar meant 20 bodies forming a wall. Predators began to learn something, too. Humans were trouble. Not because they were strong, but because they were together. And that shift didn't just change the balance of power. It started to reshape ecosystems. When humans worked as one, they hunted in ways no other species could match. Entire herds were driven off cliffs. Fires were used to corral animals into traps. The prey-predator scale tipped forever. For the first time in the long, brutal story of life on Earth, cooperation became a weapon. But it also made us thinkers. Because once we were safe, at least safer, the mind had time to wonder why. Why do predators kill? Why do we die? Why do stars move? And why does the sun always come back? And so, as the predators retreated into myth and symbol, we started to turn them into stories. The lion became courage. The snake became temptation. The wolf became both menace and protector. The very creatures that once hunted us became characters in our imagination. In some ancient way, maybe storytelling was our first act of revenge, turning fear into meaning. And maybe that's where the real evolution happened, not in the bones, but in the mind. Once we could turn danger into story, it stopped owning us. Fear became something we could share, shape, and eventually soften around the fire. Those stories grew teeth of their own. They warned, taught, comforted. They reminded every listener that monsters could be defeated, or, at least, survived. Imagine it, the quiet hum of a campfire, sparks rising into the dark, children half asleep, wrapped in furs, listening as someone's voice drifts through the smoke. A voice describing the great cat with glowing eyes, the serpent that whispers in dreams, the ancestor who outwitted death itself. These weren't just bedtime tales. They were survival manuals, dressed in poetry. Each story carried something practical: how to spot tracks, when to run, what signs meant danger. But beneath that, there was something deeper, a sense of belonging. To tell a story meant you mattered. To be remembered in one meant you lived forever. That's the quiet miracle of early humanity. They learned that words could protect almost as much as weapons. Archaeologists sometimes find carvings or markings that seem decorative, random scratches on stone. But look long enough, and you start to notice patterns, circles, lines, figures, spirals. Maybe they were symbols of clans, maybe maps, maybe prayers. But one theory suggests they were mnemonic, a way to remember the stories. That's the start of culture, right there. A tale frozen in pigment, waiting for someone else to find it. A whisper passed across 10,000 years. Of course, life wasn't all warm fires and shared myths. The environment stayed brutal. Ice ages came and went. Volcanoes erupted. Entire species vanished. And yet, the humans kept pushing forward, adapting, reshaping their tools and their minds. By this point, We weren't just surviving predators, we were outlasting them. The great cats and saber-tooths began to disappear. The massive hyenas went extinct. And wherever humans went, the landscape subtly shifted. It's hard not to feel a touch of melancholy there. The very skill that saved us, cooperation, also turned us into apex predators ourselves. The hunted had become the hunters. But even then, traces of empathy remained. Bones of wolves buried beside humans suggest companionship, not competition. Somewhere along the line, a predator became a partner. Maybe it started with a lone wolf hanging near a camp, drawn by scraps. Maybe someone tossed it a bone. Maybe, over time, fear became curiosity. Curiosity became tolerance, and tolerance became trust. The first friendship, forged not in comfort, but in mutual survival. It's strangely poetic, isn't it? The same species that once terrified us became our allies in facing the world's dangers, and together we built something new, safety. That safety gave rise to everything else, to music, to art, to memory itself. Because only when you're not constantly running for your life do you start to dream. Dreams of the hunt, dreams of the stars, dreams of something bigger than the next sunrise. And just like that, the story of survival slowly began to transform into the story of meaning. The predators outside the firelight faded into myth, but the ones inside our minds, fear, jealousy, loss, stayed with us. The difference was, now we had words for them. And with words came the power to face them, without claws or stone blades, just stories. Over time, those stories grew larger than any one campfire. They turned into cave paintings, etched deep into walls that would never see sunlight again. Bison, mammoths, handprints, layers upon layers of human thought, frozen in ochre and ash. Each image feels like a whisper across time, saying, "We were here, we endured. We saw the beasts, and we lived." Some researchers think those handprints, especially the small ones, belonged to women and children, not just hunters, which changes everything, doesn't it? It means storytelling wasn't the domain of the strong, but of the collective. Everyone contributed to the human memory. Everyone had a part in keeping the light alive. And perhaps that's the most overlooked part of early survival. It wasn't about dominance. It was about continuity. A child who learned the right story could one day be the one to pass it on. That was immortality before anyone invented religion. If you could speak, if you could remember, if you could warn, you could save. But of course, the world outside those caves kept moving. Climate shifts forced migrations. Glaciers crept forward, swallowing valleys and herds. Groups split apart, wandered, reunited, vanished. In their wake, they left small signs, footprints, tools, bones arranged with care. There's a quiet beauty in those traces. They show not just that humans moved, but that they looked back. They buried their dead. They placed flowers in graves. Literal fossilized flowers have been found near Neanderthal remains. It means even our cousins, so often painted as brutish, understood tenderness. They might have fought predators with stones and sticks, but they faced death with ceremony. And that, in its own way, is one of the most powerful forms of defiance. When you honor the dead, you deny the predator its full victory. You say, you can take the body, but not the meaning. By now, humanity had stretched from Africa into Europe, Asia, and beyond. Each group adapted in its own way, skin color, body shape, tools. Yet, wherever they went, the same patterns followed: cooperation, compassion, memory. There's a fossil from Georgia, not the American one, the Dmanisi site in Eurasia, where archaeologists found the skull of an elderly man who had lost all his teeth long before death. He couldn't have eaten on his own. He should have starved. But he didn't. His bones healed. That means someone fed him, cared for him, kept him alive. Think about that. Over 1 million years ago, someone sat down beside a dying man and decided he was worth saving, even when he could give nothing in return. No hunting, no defense, no benefit, just care. That one act, buried in the dust, might be the single most important clue to what made us human. It wasn't fire or tools or language. It was kindness, because kindness is what makes survival sustainable. It builds trust, which builds community, which builds everything else. So yes, we evolved sharper tools, stronger bodies, smarter brains. But the quiet revolution was emotional. Maybe that's why, even now, we keep circling back to stories about protection and sacrifice. Heroes saving each other, friends defying danger, love outlasting death. They're all echoes of that first decision. That first "I'll stay with you until the end." Long before civilization, that was civilization. And it's strange, the more we uncover, the more that early kindness seems deliberate, not accidental. These weren't isolated miracles. Fossils across continents show similar patterns: healed fractures, amputations that didn't kill the patient, signs of long-term survival after catastrophic injuries. Someone was tending the wounded. Someone was waiting for them to heal. It paints a very different picture from the usual image of early humans as constant warriors in a brutal world. Sure, life was hard. Predators were everywhere, from saber-toothed cats to massive hyenas. But within the tribes, compassion was just as real as competition. In some ways, it was their ultimate survival tool, more effective than claws, speed, or camouflage. Think about it. A predator relies on strength and instinct, but empathy requires imagination. To care for someone, you have to picture what they feel, what they need. That's not instinct, that's creativity. It's the seed of art, religion, storytelling, medicine. So in a strange twist, it was danger itself that made us human. The very predators that hunted us might have driven us to evolve empathy as defense. Every scream in the night forced us closer together. Every shared meal, every shelter built shoulder to shoulder, carved the outline of civilization. And the environment kept testing that bond. In some regions, volcanic eruptions wiped out entire ecosystems. In others, long winters stretched for generations. Yet, whenever catastrophe struck, small human groups adapted, not by fighting harder, but by helping smarter. There's evidence of food sharing that predates formal agriculture by tens of thousands of years. One person's catch was the tribe's meal. Hunters relied on gatherers, gatherers on firekeepers, firekeepers on elders who remembered where the water ran sweet. It was a cycle of survival built on trust. And that trust didn't just keep people alive. It created memory. Memory of danger, memory of safety, memory of each other. From there, something subtle but revolutionary began to happen. We started teaching why we helped. It wasn't just instinct anymore. It was tradition. This is how we do it. This is who we are. The concept of us. It's the first shadow of morality. Not the kind written in stone tablets, but the quiet, everyday ethics that said, share the fire, guard the weak, bury the dead, and remember the fallen. Those weren't laws. They were survival strategies that became values. So when we ask whether early humans saved each other from predators, the real answer might be deeper. They didn't just save bodies. They saved the idea of us. Every healed bone, every tool passed from one hand to another, every whispered warning about what lurks in the dark, all of it built the scaffolding of humanity. And as the millennia rolled forward, those instincts evolved into the world we know: medicine, community, friendship. The same ancient urge to keep one another safe now powers everything from hospitals to bedtime stories. Maybe that's why the world still feels a little less terrifying when someone stands beside you. It's not just comfort, it's ancient memory. The echo of a fire circle, of voices whispering through the dark, promising, we'll make it through the night. So here we are, thousands of generations later, still huddled around our modern fires. The glow just comes from screens now instead of embers. But the impulse hasn't changed. We still gather when the world feels dangerous. We still tell stories about how we survived, about who protected whom, about the ones who didn't make it, and why that matters. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear it in the rhythm of civilization itself. That soft, ancient heartbeat that started when one human looked at another and decided, no, you're not dying today. Maybe that's the truest origin of everything we call good. Before laws, before gods, Before cities, there was that choice. Not the strongest surviving, but the kindest enduring. And that choice reshaped the world. It built the invisible threads that tie us across time, from Neanderthal caves to crowded hospitals, from saber-tooth hunts to disaster relief teams. The tools changed, the language changed, the species even changed. But the instinct, that didn't. Every act of compassion we perform now carries the same ancient signature. When we reach out to steady a stranger, or care for someone sick, or stay up all night beside a loved one's bed, we're not being modern. We're being prehistoric. We're echoing something that has been etched into the bones of our species since before we had words to describe it. And maybe that's the quiet miracle of early humanity. They didn't just survive the predators. They survived each other's pain. They made room for weakness. They built a species around cooperation, even when competition would have been easier. If you strip away all the noise, the wars, the inventions, the cities, you'll find that small fire still burning in our DNA. The warmth that says, "You're safe here." The one that whispers, "Rest now, I'll keep watch." Because somewhere out on the savannah, or deep inside a cave, that's exactly what someone once said to someone else, and humanity began. So as you drift toward sleep tonight, remember them, the first helpers, the silent watchers, the ones who stood between their tribe and the dark. They didn't just fight monsters, they taught us how not to become them. And maybe that's why, even now, when we light a candle, offer a hand, or share a quiet story before bed, we're really just keeping that same promise alive. The promise that began when early humans saved each other from predators, and in doing so, learned what it meant to be human.